Life has literally changed the way the world works. We are just a small part of the Earth's biosphere, but, to our best knowledge, we're the first to spread Earth's biosphere beyond its cradle. For me, this is what comes to mind when I consider one of humankind's most significant endeavours, initiated in 1961 and sponsored by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. This was Project Apollo. And by 1969, well, this kind of speaks for itself, doesn't it? But in this lecture, I'm not going to be looking at the future of our species, or even of our biosphere. I want to look at the origins of life. And for that, I would like to start with another monumental project, but this time from 1960, a year when Kennedy would debate with Nixon, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan warns the apartheid regime in South Africa about the wind of change they would be facing, and Alfred Hitchcock would terrify moviegoers with Psycho. And then there was Project Nekton, an event of great importance that would receive no coverage at all. This was a project so risky that the Navy thought it best to keep it top secret. A project just like Apollo to explore another frontier, but this time to a frontier still on planet Earth, a mission to the greatest depths of the ocean, the Challenger Deep. Interest in the ocean floor is not a recent development. People have speculated about what's down there for a long time, but the first systematic survey of the ocean floor would have to wait for HMS Challenger that would sail out of Portsmouth on December 21st, 1872. The HMS Challenger would travel some 70,000 miles, taking ocean floor dredgers, recording the temperature of the oceans at various depths, performing open water trawls, and in the process discovering 4,700 new species of marine life. Life that included microplankton, like these radiolaria, collected, categorised, and beautifully illustrated. As recently as the late 19th century, knowledge of the ocean was basically restricted to the topmost few fathoms, about 8 feet. The Challenger would perform one of the first systematic surveys of the ocean floor using 181 miles of Italian hemp and a lead weight. Simple but effective. But on March 23rd, 1875, at sample section 225 between Guam and Palau in the southwestern Pacific, the line they tossed overboard just kept on going, eventually recording around 4,475 fathoms, about 5 miles deep. To really come to grips with this famous deep, we need to wait for this man, Swiss physicist, inventor and explorer Auguste Piccard. Actually, Auguste's first interest was the upper atmosphere. He constructed pressure spheres that he attached to high-altitude balloons to measure cosmic rays for his old buddy Albert Einstein. Later, he realised that he could modify his sphere to withstand pressures at depth too. And yes, if you're wondering, he was the inspiration for Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek, and probably also for the look-alike Professor Calculus in Tintin. What he invented was the bathyscaphe Trieste. It was launched on 26th of August 1953, operated by the French Navy, but later purchased by the US Navy. The bulk of the vessel consists of the float, filled with 22,000 US gallons of gasoline, not for power, but as a useful, non-compressible liquid for buoyancy. Lead weights were located in ballast hoppers to help the vessel sink, and would be released by electromagnets. This is actually a very clever design, as during a power failure, all the lead weights would be released and the Trieste would simply float to the surface. This buoyancy control allowed for a free dive capability, not relying on a cable to lower and pull the vessel back up. The pilots would get into the circular pressure vessel via this small tunnel. The sphere itself had steel walls that were 5 inches thick and was provided with a very small plexiglass window through which all of the observations were going to be made. The dive occurred in complete secrecy, given the possibility of failure, and began on January 23rd, 1960. The Trieste would carry Jacques Piccard, that's the son of Auguste, and Lieutenant Don Walsh of the US Navy. Shadowed by the USS Lewis, the Trieste descended towards the Challenger Deep. the location that HMS Challenger had sampled about 85 years earlier. They entered complete darkness by 3,000 feet, with only an occasional bioluminescent organism to break the gloom. And after 2 hours at 30,000 feet, bang! The whole ship shudders and an ominous crack appeared in the plexiglass window. Fortunately, the window was made in two halves and only the outer pane was damaged. Bravely, Jacques and Don decide to carry on. Personally, I would have been heading back to the surface for cocktails. At 4 hours and 47 minutes, they reach the ocean floor at 35,814 feet. Just before touchdown, they spot a flatfish swimming by. Quite a surprise, as it was not known that fish could survive at these great pressures and depths. Pressures close to 16,000 pounds per square inch. That's 1,000 times the standard atmospheric pressure at sea level. And if you want an idea as to how deep the Challenger Deep is, consider this. If you could drop Mount Everest into the sea at this location, it would sink to the seafloor with 1.28 miles of ocean still above the top of the peak. This mission ran at a time when the paradigm about how the world looks and operates was changing. People like Harry Hess, Bruce Heason and Marie Tharp and a whole host of others were piecing together what would become our modern understanding of plate tectonics. Significantly, the ocean floor turned out to be full of topography and not largely flat as many had previously assumed. Rather than a static planet, the Earth was found to be an active, dynamic world with oceans opening and closing and continents zipping around the surface of the planet. We now know that magma oozes up at the ridges in the ocean crust, forming new material and pushing the older oceanic lithosphere away to either side. Continents are carried as the plates spread away from the ridges. Ultimately, oceanic lithosphere descends into the mantle at the ocean trenches. Project Necton provided vital information about one of those trenches. The Challenger Deep is just part of the Mariana Trench, a feature that's around about 2,550 kilometres long, that's about 1,580 miles, with an average width of 69 kilometres, that's 43 miles. This is just one of the many trenches surrounding the Pacific Ocean, marking the point where the Pacific Plate is being subducted into Earth's mantle. The groundbreaking work of the Trieste would pave the way for exploration of another feature of the newly resolved ocean floor, those plate-generating ridges running like a series of baseball seams traversing the Earth's oceans. And with the exploration of these new features, a new possibility regarding the origin of life itself would emerge too. Ocean ridges produce new ocean crust, and as such, they are hot, active, dynamic features of our planet. They form a chain of volcanic mountains about 31,000 miles long, rising an average of about 2.7 miles above the sea floor. For comparison, the volcano Mount Rainier in Washington State is about the same height above sea level. Although the global mid-ocean ridge system is mostly hidden beneath the ocean surface, it is the most prominent feature on the surface of our planet. So in this lecture, let's build on the pioneering work of Project Necton as we look into the intriguing hypotheses regarding the origin of life and ultimately the origin of the science of paleontology in the ocean depths. Let's ask, how do we explore the Earth's mid-ocean mountain chain? Do we have geological and paleontological evidence for undersea volcanic ecosystems? Why are deep oceanic volcanoes a good candidate for life's origins? And could life have arisen in a similar manner on other worlds? By the 1970s, sonar and magnetic mapping of the ocean floor had pinpointed the location of Earth's ocean ridge systems, but no one had ever seen them up close. Even so, some had speculated that they might be the site of hydrothermal activity, areas where ocean water would sink into cracks in the newly formed crust, become heated by magmatic fluids and the still warm rocks, and get expelled again as hot water, just like Old Faithful in Yellowstone National Park. It is these submarine geysers that may hold the key to the origin of life on Earth. In truth, We had hints of the existence of these underwater hot springs going as far back as the early 1880s. A Russian ship, the Vital, was sailing in the Red Sea close to Mecca when it sampled water at 200 feet, which appeared to be warmer than the water at the surface. The presence of hot mineral-rich or salty brines in this area was confirmed by later expeditions. In 1965, the research vessel Atlantis II recorded water of temperatures around 133 degrees Fahrenheit and recovered a sample of oozy sediment that was reported as being too hot to touch. Intrigued by this development, the US National Science Foundation sent the research vessel Chain to take more readings, but this time sediment cores of the ocean floor would be taken too. The sediment they retrieved was bizarre, rich in metals like copper, zinc and manganese. The sedimentary strata were also extremely colourful, with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute researcher Egon Degens describing their colours as being as bright as an Indian sand painting or a Mexican serape. By now, the idea of spreading ocean floors was being widely accepted, with the Red Sea identified as a young and newly formed oceanic rift. The hunt was on for other oceanic hydrothermal sites during the 1970s, using elevated seafloor water temperatures as a proxy for hydrothermal activity. In 1972, a promising site was selected by the presence of hot water found on earlier expeditions. This site was explored by the research vessel Thomas Washington on the South Toe expedition to the Galapagos Rift Zone. The expedition included a rig called Deep Toe that was outfitted with sonar, magnetometers and cameras to take pictures of the ocean floor. The project was funded in part by the US Navy, who were motivated by the awful loss of the submarine USS Thresher in 1963 in the North Atlantic. Such experimental technology, it was hoped, could perhaps be of use in future emergencies at sea. Robotic and submarine-mounted cameras recorded curious mounds encrusted with minerals around 15 to 75 feet high, sticking above the ocean floor sediments about 10 to 12 miles south of the Galapagos Rift. They also detected hot fluids rising from the ridge and recorded bursts of earthquakes where the water temperature was particularly high. Another very strange observation was the sudden appearance of dead bottom-dwelling fish at the surface, like this cusk eel, above the area where the small earthquakes were detected. What was happening here would reign a mystery until 1977, when the DSV Alvin, the descendant of Picard's Trieste, would visit the Galapagos Rift. The team on this mission included experts in many fields of geoscience, but no one thought biologists would be needed. That proved to be an oversight. Although they found wonderful hydrothermal vents spewing hot mineral-rich water, they also found a rich and bizarre biological community associated with these hot springs. The inhabitants included mussels and white clams, some over a foot long, and bacteria-laden beardworms, many times larger than their shallow water relatives, that covered the lava rock. White crabs and purple octopuses scuttled around this shelly community too. One of the odd creatures they found they called a sea dandelion. They're actually a member of the phylum Cnidaria, that includes jellyfish and corals. Called the siphonophores, they're closely related to the surface-dwelling Portuguese man-of-war. Like all siphonophores, the sea dandelion is not one animal, but a colony composed of zooids performing different functions like defence, feeding and reproduction. At one spot that was named the Garden of Eden, they found 1.5 foot long tube worms swaying in the warm waters close to the scalding, about 750 degrees Fahrenheit, water of the vents. The Garden of Eden was a relatively new volcanic site and was at the exact location where the earthquakes and dead fish were recorded in 1972. What the scientists had unknowingly recorded back then was a volcanic eruption on the ridge, causing the earthquakes and killing off the fish. These wonderful and bizarre creatures were completely unexpected, and as a result of this abundance of riches, there was hardly any formaldehyde to preserve the specimens they brought back. Indeed, they had to resort to some fairly powerful Russian vodka when the formaldehyde ran out. But how could creatures live down there? The common view at the time was that all biological systems were based on food chains powered at their base by the sun, a photosynthetic pyramid. It is possible that the marine detritus, or snow, a continual shower of organic material, mostly composed of decomposed organisms, from the surface waters, could be supporting this distinctive ecosystem. However, it was unlikely that this could support the vast biomass observed on the rift. Something else other than the sun must be powering life down here. Hints to the source came from the smell that came from the water collected by Alvin. The distinctive smell of rotten eggs, the smell of hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is produced by primitive microscopic microbes called archaea, such as Archaeologobulus fulgidus, living in and on hot rocks and sediments. They take sulfate that occurs in seawater and reduce it, chemically removing oxygen, producing energy and releasing hydrogen sulfide as a waste product. Higher organisms feed on the bacteria, making this a chemosynthetic rather than a photosynthetic-based ecosystem. Okay, so this is a unique ecosystem. What does that have to do with the origin of life? Well, before we get there, let's first look at vent systems through a paleontological lens. Do we even have evidence of these hydrothermal vent systems in the geological past? We do. In fact, a lot of attention has been focused on these systems recently, as they are an important source of metal ores. The vents form as cold water descends into cracks in the ocean floor where it is heated by hot rocks still close to the magmatic source of the ridge. The seawater starts to alter and get altered by minerals present in the surrounding rocks. The altered seawater is then expelled as a superheated, metal-rich brine through hydrothermal vents like these so-called black smokers. These volcanogenic massive sulfides, or VMS deposits, are important sources of ores containing copper, zinc, lead, gold and silver. But these metal sulfides are not the only indicators of these ancient ecosystems. We find whole fossilized vent communities too. For example, researchers, including Crispin Little of the University of Leeds, were investigating the sulfide deposit in the San Rafael Mountains of California near Santa Barbara. In addition to typical metal sulfide minerals, they also found a number of fossil creatures that were part of this vent community. Using fossil plankton called radiolarians, this ecosystem was dated to the early Jurassic period between 190 and 182 million years ago. Using the inclination of magnetic minerals within the rocks, the researchers were able to determine the paleolatitude of this material at time of formation. It originally formed somewhere along the equator on the Farallon Plate, a slab of ancient oceanic crust which, over many millions of years, has been in collision with Western North America. As collision occurred, parts of the plate that didn't get subducted had been accreted to the western edge of North America and elevated by crustal movements, so that we now have what was once an ancient ocean vent system, high and dry in the San Rafael Mountains. The fossils they found included tube worms like those found in modern vent systems, a gastropod and a species of brachiopod, a creature resembling a clam but from a different group of animals. These creatures were living around a vent system and, not unlike modern vent systems today, likely had microbes living in their tissues, what we call endosymbionts, like some of their modern counterparts. Geologically speaking, though, these ancient vent communities are pretty recent, and if we're interested in the origin of life, we need to go way back in time. One of the oldest fossil vent systems we currently have comes from northeastern China, just 150 kilometers east of Beijing. This ancient Precambrian community was described in 2007 by Zhang Li of Peking University and Timothy Kuski of St. Louis University. What they discovered was evidence of a volcanogenic massive sulfide deposit dating to 1.43 billion years ago. That is well before the diversification of multicellular creatures. These sections actually preserve some of the black smoker hydrothermal vent chimneys as well, just like the ones we find under the ocean today. But there was more, for within these ore deposits were the fossilized remains of microbes that were living in and on this ancient hydrothermal system. Some of these microbes were forming biofilms and producing layered dome structures on the nearby ocean floor and around the vents. The microbial community was probably sulfate reducing, just like microbes in modern vent settings, and these ecosystems are almost 1.5 billion years old. As ancient as this is, though, it is not as old as the oldest fossils. We have already met them in another lecture in this series. They come from the Pilbara area of Western Australia in a section called Strelley Pool, dated to 3.43 billion years old, way older than the vent fossils in China. Today, the area is dry and desolate, but beautifully desolate in a way. However, at 3.43 billion years ago, it was very different. Back then, Strelley Pool would have been on the edge of an ocean, and the fossils in question were microbes living between grains of sand on a tidally influenced beach. They were also living in an oxygen-free environment. It would be many hundreds of millions of years before significant quantities of oxygen would accumulate on the Earth. This shallow, sunlit and relatively low temperature and pressure environment is very different, though, to any of the vent systems, modern or fossils, we've described earlier. So given that the oldest vent fossils we find are much younger than those at Strelley Pool, why are scientists so keen on hydrothermal vents as being the location for the origin of life? Well, for a start, there are a lot of raw materials down there. All those metals can act as catalysts for the generation of useful organics in these hydrothermal pressure cookers. But something else too. When you consider the tree of life moving down from the tips of the twigs, down the branches, and eventually to the main trunk, it would appear that the last universal common ancestor of living things today was what we call an extreme thermophile, or in other words, it was a microbe that liked the heat, just like we find in modern oceanic hydrothermal settings. Our job now is to come up with a hypothesis that bridges the gaps from an inorganic environment to organic molecules to the first living cells on Earth. Some ideas centre around the production of self-replicating molecules, the precursors of life, although probably not DNA, which itself requires enzymes to reproduce themselves, which are encoded on DNA, a classic chicken and egg scenario. However, perhaps a simpler self-replicating molecule, like single-stranded RNA, a molecule present even in very simple life forms, was the earliest form of life. This formed the basis of RNA world, a phrase coined by Nobel laureate Walter Gilbert in 1986 to describe how the first biosphere on Earth may have been RNA and not DNA based. But more recently, scientists have speculated that a metabolism first model would make more sense. Work at the University College of London by chemists like Nora de Liu and Nathan Hollingsworth have shown that the mineral greigite, found inside hydrothermal vents, might be acting like enzymes in living organisms, providing a catalytic site for carbon dioxide dissolved in seawater. In addition, vent systems also provide a lot of heat to power chemical reactions that can generate complex organic molecules like formic acid, acetic acid, methanol, and pyruvic acid, an important component in the metabolism of modern organisms. But it has also been suggested that although hydrothermal systems are our best bet for the location of the origin of life, perhaps we've been looking at the wrong type of hydrothermal system. In the year 2000, a National Science Foundation funded project was exploring an area about 2,300 miles east of Florida and 62 miles west of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This topographic high is called the Atlantis Massif, located on this 1.2 to 1.5 million year old ocean floor. was found an area called the Lost City, and you can see why. What they found was astounding, a field of hydrothermal vents very different from those that are found sitting on the spreading ridges themselves. In 2003, the submersible vessel Alvin once again descended to the depths, this time finding white cream-coloured chimneys composed of calcium carbonate rising 30 to 60 feet off the ocean floor. Unlike the dark-coloured black smokers of a ridge axis, these structures are not releasing significant amounts of carbon dioxide or hydrogen sulfide. Instead, they are producing high quantities of hydrogen and methane with some intermixed hydrogen sulfide, and in alkaline rather than acidic waters of the black smokers. The local environment is cooler as well, still hot, but not the scorching 760 degrees Fahrenheit of a black smoker. The white city pillars of the Lost City emit water closer to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat driving these hydrothermal systems, though, is not from young, hot rocks freshly formed at mid-ocean ridge systems. The heat in this system comes from a geological process called serpentinization. At the Atlantis Massif, mantle rocks called peridotite has been brought close to the surface by faults. These rocks, rich in the mineral olivine, are only stable at great depths and high temperatures. Bringing peridotite rocks close to the surface and causing them to interact with seawater moving through cracks in the sea floor results in a major transformation. In this transformation, olivine changes into other minerals like magnetite and serpentine, forming a rock called serpentinite. This transformation is an exothermal reaction that generates heat, enough to raise the temperatures to about 550 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 260 degrees centigrade. It is this heat that helps drive the Lost City system, very different to the black smoker systems that are driven by magmatic heat. The serpentinite produced is also lower in density than peridotite, which causes the immediate area to rise and fracture. This introduces more seawater into the crust and continues the process, a kind of a positive feedback loop. So could areas containing white smokers be a better location for the generation of life? They certainly have a proven record of producing important quantities of organic molecules and have the energy and catalyst present to power an interesting biochemistry. They have another advantage too. The chimneys at the Lost City have been forming for about 30,000 years. That's around 2 orders of magnitude longer than most black smoker systems, which will only be active while they are over the hot magmatic rocks of the spreading centre. This serpentinite-powered system, therefore, may provide a longer-term site for the evolution of a complex biochemistry and perhaps life itself. The rocks of both hydrothermal systems also possess an interesting microstructure, tiny pockets where organic chemistry could be concentrated and perhaps develop other features such as a cell membrane. At a certain point in time, these primitive cells may have become sufficiently resilient to leave the vent system and start to populate the ocean. But let's pause just for a second. Just what is life? Perhaps we can define it by the 3 common components to all life on Earth. Firstly, metabolism, that's chemical reactions that power life. Encapsulation, something to isolate the creature from the external environment, like a cell membrane. And reproduction, which in the earliest organisms would have consisted of fission or budding and other asexual replicating processes. Once this was achieved and life could pass copies of itself into the future, the biosphere was born, perhaps deep in the dark ocean depths in a hot rocky nursery. The vent discoveries we have been discussing have also opened up the possibilities for the search for life elsewhere in the solar system. In particular, astrobiologists are interested in moons like Europa that orbits Jupiter and Enceladus that orbits Saturn. It is thought that Europa may have a liquid water ocean below its icy crust, perhaps maintained by the gravitational tidal action of Jupiter that would massage the interior of the planet, generating heat and perhaps allowing for the existence of hydrothermal vents around which life might develop. These ideas might be tested if a NASA mission, such as a Europa Multiple Flyby mission satellite, is launched sometime in the future. We also have spectacular evidence of a similar ocean on Enceladus, where NASA's Cassini satellite detected jets of water being released from the moon in 2005. Cassini was actually able to fly through these plumes and detected not only water vapour, but also nitrogen, methane, and carbon dioxide, all useful building blocks for the formation of interesting organic chemistry, and perhaps leading to the biochemistry of the simplest organisms. It is possible that there may be hydrothermal vents deep in Enceladus too, and if so, perhaps life as well. This is an exciting possibility, not only in the search for extraterrestrial life, but also for the history of life on our planet. If life is found around such vent systems on other worlds, then perhaps anywhere where we have liquid water and hydrothermal vents, we should expect life processes to initiate. Confirming this will probably come well after I have been recycled into the Earth's biosphere. But what a wonderful confirmation that would be.